Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Today, in our video, I'll revisit all 7 Defense Against the Dark Arts professors and explore interesting facts that the films, unfortunately, didn't show. Let's dive into the world of magical teachers, starting with the first one, Professor Quirrell, and find out what important moments were left out of the adaptation. Enjoy watching. Number 1. Professor Quirrell was a genius. Quirinus Quirrell was the first Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Hogwarts. In the films, he is depicted as a cowardly and weak wizard, but the books gave him a much more flattering characterization. Hagrid told Harry that although Quirrell was nervous and odd, his intellect was on par with the best. He became the only one who managed to find Voldemort, which confirms his abilities. Number 2. Gilderoy Lockhart appeared in Order of the Phoenix. After the events of the Chamber of Secrets, Lockhart disappeared from the films, but in the books there was an interesting episode where Harry and his friends meet him at St. Mungo's Hospital. Despite losing his memory, Lockhart retained his charm and good looks. This adds layers to his character that were not shown in the films. Number 3. Remus Lupin turned out to be a coward. Remus Lupin was probably the best Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. He taught Harry how to face fear, was patient and fair. However, the film did not show an important moment. When Lupin began a romance with Nymphadora Tonks, he feared that his lycanthropy would bring her pain, and he left her, unable to deal with his fears, even though he taught others to be strong. Number 4. Barty Crouch Jr. was imprisoned by his father. Barty Crouch Jr. played an important role in The Goblet of Fire, but the films missed an important detail. After being imprisoned by his father, he lived under the Imperious Curse for many years. When Voldemort learned about this, he swapped their places, and Crouch Sr. ended up being under the curse. Number 5. Dolores Umbridge lied about the Slytherin locket. Dolores Umbridge is not only the worst defense professor, but also one of the most detestable characters in the series. In the films, her moral depravity was vividly shown, but there is an important moment in the books that was missed. She lied about the Slytherin locket, calling it a family heirloom, which angered Harry. Number 6. Severus Snape loved the dark arts. After many attempts, Severus Snape finally became the defense professor in Harry's 6th year. Although the film did not reveal all the nuances, the books show that Snape was as harsh as in potion-making and truly loved the dark arts. Interestingly, his approach to defense and teaching Harry was similar to his own view of magic, with respect and fear. Number 7. Amicus Caro renamed the subject to Dark Arts. In the films, very little was said about Amicus and Alecto Caro. However, in the books it turned out that Amicus became the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, and the course was renamed. Instead of learning defense, students were taught dark spells and forbidden practices. Number 8. Mad-Eye Moody gave real lessons, only to Harry. Throughout Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Barty Crouch Jr., disguised as Mad-Eye Moody, teaches the students about defense against the dark arts. However, what the films don't make clear is that Crouch, while pretending to be Moody, only provided real and valuable lessons to Harry. The rest of the class received a much less comprehensive education. The rest of the students never learned the depths of what they needed to know, the book says, highlighting how Crouch's lessons were tailored specifically for Harry, who was becoming a key player in the battle against dark forces. One of the most important lessons Crouch, disguised as Moody, taught Harry was how to resist the imperious curse. While the rest of the class practiced basic spells, Harry received personal training to fight the curse that allowed dark wizards to control others. This individual attention made Harry one of the few wizards capable of resisting the imperious curse in his later life. The irony of it all is striking. Harry learned these vital skills from a servant of Voldemort himself, a man whose loyalty lay with the very forces Harry was trying to defeat. Number 9. Lupin almost attacked Harry, Ron, and Hermione earlier than the film showed. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, the film shows a tense moment when Professor Lupin transforms into a werewolf and almost attacks Harry, Ron, and Hermione near the Shrieking Shack. However, the films omit a key moment that could have led to a much earlier confrontation. In the book, as Harry, Ron, and Hermione are heading back from Hagrid's cabin after the execution of Buckbeak, they find themselves dangerously close to Lupin, who is in the midst of his transformation. The trio has no idea that Lupin is about to change. They are walking near the Forbidden Forest when Lupin, who had forgotten to take his Wolfsbane potion, begins to shift. The tension in the moment is palpable. They were still walking in the direction of the forest when a shadow appeared. The book describes, signaling that they are far too close to the danger. If it hadn't been for Snape's timely intervention, they would have been in grave danger. Snape appears just in time, calling them back to Hogwarts. "What are you doing here?" Snape shouts at them, forcing them to turn around and head back to safety. Had Snape not stepped in, the situation could have ended in tragedy. The trio was unaware of the looming danger, and without Snape's quick thinking, Lupin's transformation could have led to devastating consequences long before the events at the Shrieking Shack. Number 10. Severus Snape wasn't the only candidate for the position in 6th year. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, there is an important detail about Severus Snape's appointment as defense against the dark arts teacher that the films leave out. Dumbledore didn't consider Snape the only candidate for the position. In fact, Dumbledore also considered Horace Slughorn, the former potions master, for the job. During a conversation with Harry, Dumbledore admits, "I invited Horace to take the defense post, but he preferred to return to his familiar role as potions master." This revelation makes Snape's appointment much more significant. It wasn't a random choice. Dumbledore didn't just choose Snape out of necessity or convenience. It was part of a deliberate plan. By giving Snape the defense role, Dumbledore was preparing him for something far bigger than teaching. He knew the time was coming when Snape's loyalty would be tested, and this appointment gave Snape the opportunity to prove his true allegiance. Dumbledore's strategy was clear. By placing Snape in this position, he forced him into a role where his true intentions would eventually be exposed. As Dumbledore told Harry, Snape was the best candidate for the role, but the true reason I chose him was to ensure that he had the chance to do what was necessary. This decision was a calculated risk, but Dumbledore believed it was crucial to prepare both Snape and Harry for the coming battle. Number 11. Dolores Umbridge hated half-humans. Dolores Umbridge was already an immensely detestable character in the films, but the books reveal a darker side of her, one that the movies only hint at. Her hatred wasn't just reserved for students who disobeyed her. She had a deep loathing for magical creatures and half-breeds. This aspect of her cruelty went far beyond what was shown in the movies, adding layers of malice to her already twisted personality. In the Order of the Phoenix, it becomes clear that Umbridge was behind some of the most restrictive and hateful legislation in the wizarding world. She authored laws that severely limited the rights of werewolves, centaurs, and house elves, groups she considered inferior. Her treatment of these magical beings was not just a matter of policy, it was a reflection of her personal prejudice. She viewed them as, quote, "three," and beneath her, and she made it her mission to oppress them in every way possible. Her hatred reached its peak after the confrontation in the Forbidden Forest, where she was captured by centaurs. The event left a deep mark on her psyche, and when she returned to the ministry, her bitterness had only grown. She became more determined to punish those she considered unworthy of magical society. Quote 5. She would say, her words filled with disdain. The encounter with the centaurs only fueled her desire for revenge. This venomous attitude didn't just shape her laws, it shaped her every action. After her return to the ministry, Umbridge's obsession with control became all-consuming. She continued to seek out ways to punish those she deemed unfit, her cruelty magnified by the personal vendetta she carried against magical creatures and beings. Her policies, backed by her vile beliefs, made her one of the most loathed figures in the wizarding world, and the depth of her hatred was truly frightening. Number 12. Gilderoy Lockhart was almost sorted into Ravenclaw. Gilderoy Lockhart, with his charm and flair, was a character who might have been a perfect fit for Ravenclaw. This house valued intelligence and curiosity above all else, traits that Lockhart certainly possessed. In fact, his fascination with fame and his need to be admired often overshadowed his desire for knowledge. His ego, his ambition to be recognized, led him down a path that would place him in Gryffindor instead. In the Order of the Phoenix, a subtle but telling detail emerges. The portrait of Gilderoy Lockhart hangs proudly in the headmaster's office, among other distinguished Gryffindor alumni. The irony is palpable. Lockhart, a man who craved fame more than anything, had become a symbol of success in a house that valued bravery and honor. This moment in the story underscores how far his vanity and desire for recognition had taken him, making him a figure who was far more concerned with his image than with the true pursuit of knowledge. The contrast between Ravenclaw and Gryffindor's values becomes apparent when you look at Lockhart's life. He was undoubtedly intelligent, with a talent for memory charms that helped him craft his many fabricated achievements. But rather than using this skill for genuine learning, he sought to create a legacy of fame. "I'm a very talented wizard," he often boasted, a line that hints at his self-absorption and misplaced priorities. He could have thrived in Ravenclaw, but his thirst for fame pushed him toward Gryffindor. In many ways, Lockhart's portrait hanging in the headmaster's office is a small, ironic tribute to his obsession with fame. It was as if Dumbledore himself was commenting on how far Lockhart had fallen from the qualities that Ravenclaw truly valued. Instead of becoming a great mind, Lockhart's ego led him to a more fleeting form of greatness, one that, in the end, was built on falsehoods. Number 13. Remus Lupin got the job only because of Sirius Black. In the films, it seems that Remus Lupin earned his position at Hogwarts because of his skills as a teacher. He was kind, patient, and knowledgeable about the dark arts. But in J.K. Rowling's books, the truth is more complicated. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Dumbledore reveals that his decision to hire Lupin wasn't based solely on his qualifications as an educator. The headmaster had a much more personal reason for inviting him to Hogwarts. Dumbledore admitted to Harry that he had hired Lupin because of his past connection to Sirius Black. The headmaster knew that only Lupin could protect Harry from the threat of Sirius. As Dumbledore explained, Remus Lupin knows Sirius Black better than anyone. He will be the one to help Harry when the time comes. It was not just about Lupin's teaching abilities. It was about his unique understanding of the dangerous situation Harry was facing. Lupin was, in essence, a living shield between Harry and the looming threat of his godfather, who, at that time, was believed to be a murderer. Dumbledore trusted that Lupin could be the one to uncover the truth, not only to protect Harry, but to ensure the boy's safety in a situation no one truly understood. The job, therefore, was not just an academic position for Lupin, it was a role in a much larger, darker plan. Lupin's presence at Hogwarts was part of a broader strategy, one that involved keeping a close watch on Sirius Black. Dumbledore knew that the threat of Black was far from over, and that Lupin's experience and knowledge would be key in preventing harm to Harry. In the end, Lupin, his connection to Sirius wasn't just a distant part of his past, it was the reason he was called to Hogwarts in the first place. Number 14. Professor Quirrell once taught Muggle studies. Before becoming the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, Professor Quirrell had a completely different role at Hogwarts. He taught Muggle studies. This is something the films never touched upon. In J.K. Rowling's books, we learn that Quirrell, a nervous and mild-mannered man, once lectured students on the wonders of the Muggle world, how to use electricity, what a car was, and how Muggles live without magic. He was a man fascinated by the ordinary world, far removed from the dark forces that would later consume him. Imagine the irony of it all. The man who would eventually host the Dark Lord Voldemort on the back of his head was once explaining the simple mechanics of the Muggle world to young witches and wizards. It's a startling contrast. The teacher who once spoke of everyday human inventions and creatures now became the one to carry the greatest evil in the wizarding world. The twist of fate was truly profound. This transformation took place after Quirrell's journey to Albania. There, he encountered Voldemort, and that meeting turned his life upside down. The books make it clear that Quirrell returned to Hogwarts as a changed man. He had met someone very powerful, who had changed him forever. It was no longer the mild, soft-spoken professor who would timidly ask for help with a glass of water. Quirrell was now a vessel for a dark and malevolent force. The shift from Muggle studies to Defense Against the Dark Arts was not just a change of job, but a complete redefinition of Quirrell's identity. As Voldemort's influence grew stronger, so did Quirrell's connection to the dark arts. His obsession with power and the unknown led him down a dangerous path, one that would end with him becoming a mere puppet to a master much older and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. Number 15. Lupin and Snape were at war during their time at school. In the bustling halls of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, there was a tension that few outside its walls could comprehend. The rivalry between Severus Snape and Remus Lupin was more than mere animosity. It was a battle that stretched back to their school years, a feud that festered and intensified over the years. Though their conflict was briefly touched upon in the films, the depths of their rivalry are fully revealed in J.K. Rowling's books, where it becomes clear just how far back their disdain for each other went and how deeply it impacted their interactions with others. Severus Snape, the ever-sullen potions master, harboured a resentment towards Remus Lupin that started long before the latter ever set foot in the Defence Against the Dark Arts classroom. Snape, with his sharp tongue and even sharper gaze, seemed to take a special pleasure in belittling Lupin whenever the opportunity arose. His disdain for Lupin went beyond simple dislike. It was personal. The reason for this was rooted in their shared past as students at Hogwarts, during which Snape's bitterness toward Lupin began to solidify. It all started in their time as classmates. Snape, a member of Slytherin, found himself at odds with Lupin, who, despite his humble and gentle demeanour, was one of the most liked Gryffindors. Lupin was intelligent, kind, and well-liked by both students and professors alike, qualities that seemed to irk Snape. But what truly set the stage for their bitter rivalry was Lupin's secret. He was a werewolf. The truth of Lupin's condition was not widely known at school, but Snape discovered it. The secret became a weapon in his hands, a way to hurt Lupin in a way that no one else could. He held it over Lupin's head, threatening to reveal it to the entire school, knowing full well how devastating the revelation would be. The animosity reached its peak when Snape took advantage of Lupin's vulnerability. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Lupin is revealed to have taken the post of Defence Against the Dark Arts professor, a position that, ironically, Snape had once hoped to hold. The rivalry between the two men simmered beneath the surface, but Snape's cruelty was not easily masked. He made it a point to subtly humiliate Lupin in front of his students, often using his knowledge of Lupin's condition to make thinly veiled comments that could only be understood by those who were paying attention. For example, in one particular scene, Snape makes a remark about the werewolf's natural form, a comment that is so subtle that only those familiar with Lupin's secret could fully comprehend its implications. Snape's face would darken with satisfaction as he saw the discomfort that this caused Lupin, who remained ever so composed, his expression betraying only a fleeting trace of annoyance. While Snape's words cut deep, Lupin, ever the gentleman, would respond with a restrained, almost sarcastic comment, turning the attack back on Snape without ever revealing his own hurt. It was a masterful form of restraint, but it only served to deepen Snape's bitterness. In contrast to Snape's aggression, Lupin's approach was more measured. He understood that to engage Snape in direct confrontation would only escalate matters, so he chose to avoid unnecessary conflict. However, this did not mean that Lupin was completely passive. When Snape would slyly insinuate that Lupin was not fit to teach or make disparaging remarks about his condition, Lupin would offer a mild retort, often delivered with a dry wit that left Snape even more frustrated. One of the most telling moments of this rivalry is in The Prisoner of Azkaban, when Snape talks insults about Lupin, is his werewolf nature become more frequent and blatant. Lupin, however, rarely retaliates in kind. Instead, he would smile faintly and brush off the insult with a remark that only the most perceptive could understand as a defense. His ability to remain calm and unflustered, even in the face of Snape's overt hostility, only served to further infuriate Snape. Lupin's unwillingness to openly confront Snape made Snape's provocations all the more infuriating. It was clear that Snape was trying to provoke a reaction from Lupin, hoping to see him lose his composure. But Lupin, unlike many others, was not easily rattled. He had learned the hard way to control his emotions, to keep his secrets close and his temper in check. Yet the cruelty of Snape, his comments, often disguised as subtle barbs, began to wear on him. The tension between them became almost palpable, especially when Snape would insult Lupin's teaching abilities in front of students, as he did in the memorable scene in The Prisoner of Azkaban, when Snape attempts to discredit Lupin's methods in front of Harry and his classmates. Despite the animosity, there was one significant moment when Lupin's restraint almost broke. In a scene where Snape mocks Lupin for his werewolf condition, Lupin's calm demeanor cracks for just a moment, revealing a flicker of real pain. However, this brief moment of vulnerability quickly disappears as Lupin pulls himself together, masking his true feelings behind a wry smile. This moment is telling. It shows that while Lupin had learned to control his emotions over the years, the wounds of his past, especially those inflicted by Snape, still lingered. It also highlights the true nature of Snape's cruelty. He was not simply mocking Lupin for his condition, he was deliberately reminding him of the isolation and shame that Lupin had spent a lifetime trying to overcome. Lupin's behavior in the classroom and his reluctance to engage in open conflict with Snape also had an impact on his students. Harry Potter, in particular, was keenly aware of the dynamic between the two men. Harry, who had witnessed Snape's many attempts to humiliate Lupin, could see the strain it caused. However, Harry also admired Lupin's ability to remain composed in the face of such provocations. He learned, as did many other students, that strength was not always displayed through outward aggression, but through the quiet, dignified way Lupin carried himself in the face of adversity. Number 16, Umbridge was punished after Voldemort's fall. After the defeat of Lord Voldemort, the wizarding world slowly began to heal from the years of fear and oppression. The Battle of Hogwarts marked the turning point in the long struggle for freedom, and with Voldemort's downfall, the Ministry of Magic began the difficult task of restoring order and justice. Among the many figures who had contributed to the dark times, one name stood out as particularly notorious: Dolores Umbridge, a woman whose cruelty, manipulation, and thirst for power had left deep scars on both Hogwarts and the larger wizarding community. However, her fate after Voldemort's fall was one that revealed the slow but inevitable return of justice, a fact that many readers might have overlooked in the movies, but was made painfully clear in the books. Amid the celebrations and rebuilding efforts, as the wizarding world sought to regain a sense of normalcy, one of the first acts of justice came in the form of the arrest of Dolores Umbridge. Her crimes were numerous and grievous, but perhaps most heinous was the way she had treated those she deemed beneath her. As the Hogwarts High Inquisitor, and later as the Ministry's appointed Professor of Defense against the Dark Arts, Umbridge had shown no mercy for students, teachers, or magical creatures who stood in her way. Her actions against Harry Potter, her oppression of his friends, and her authoritarian rule were just the beginning of her twisted influence on the magical community. Her true cruelty, however, lay in her treatment of Muggle-born wizards and witches. During Voldemort's rise to power, Umbridge had taken advantage of the growing fear to solidify her position within the Ministry of Magic. As a devout follower of the Death Eaters, she had made it her mission to root out and punish Muggle-borns who were deemed unworthy to practice magic. Her tenure as the Ministry's Undersecretary had been marked by harsh decrees and an insidious propaganda campaign that painted Muggle-borns as inferior and dangerous. This dangerous rhetoric echoed the very beliefs held by Voldemort himself, and was part of her wider effort to maintain power in a world that was quickly losing its grip on logic and fairness. Yet it was not just her treatment of Muggle-borns that sealed her fate. The most shocking aspect of her reign was her ability to manipulate the legal system, fabricating charges against innocents and sending them to Azkaban without a trial. She had no qualms about abusing her position to punish those she believed were threats to her dominance. Under her rule, people were imprisoned, often without evidence, simply because they were born of Muggle parentage or opposed her oppressive regime. It was this cruelty that made her one of the most despised characters in the Harry Potter universe. While the war against Voldemort raged, the Ministry of Magic was forced to recognize the threats to its own integrity. Umbridge's power had been bolstered by Voldemort's own dark reign, and while the Dark Lord was defeated, his influence lingered in the corners of the Ministry, in the minds of those like Umbridge who had embraced his vision of a pure-blood society. When Voldemort fell, it was not only a victory for the forces of good, but also the beginning of a reckoning for those who had served him. The first step toward justice was the dismantling of the Ministry, the corrupt infrastructure. A new government, led by figures like Kingsley Shacklebolt, worked tirelessly to rid the Ministry of those who had allowed darkness to flourish. Among those figures was Dolores Umbridge, whose name became synonymous with cruelty and deceit. In the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's defeat, Umbridge's actions came under closer scrutiny as the Ministry sought to bring accountability to the actions of those who had supported the Death Eaters. In the books it is mentioned that Umbridge's arrest was a direct result of her actions during the time she was in power. She was captured by members of the Order of the Phoenix, who had been working behind the scenes to gather evidence against her. Once evidence of her crimes was presented to the new Ministry, her fate was sealed. She was sent to Azkaban, the notorious wizarding prison, to pay for her role in the suffering of so many innocent lives. Her arrest was not just a symbolic victory, but a concrete example of justice prevailing, no matter how long it took. The Ministry of Magic had finally rid itself of the toxic influence that had allowed such corruption to thrive. The people of the wizarding world had seen how Umbridge's actions had destroyed lives, shattered trust, and perpetuated fear. Her punishment was long overdue, but the new government, now focused on rebuilding the wizarding world, knew that a just society could not allow such figures to go unpunished. Dolores Umbridge's imprisonment sent a clear message to the wizarding community. No one, not even those in positions of power, would be above the law. In the years following the Battle of Hogwarts, the aftermath of Umbridge's arrest played a crucial role in the healing process. Her punishment was a small but significant part of the larger effort to restore the Ministry of Magic to its original purpose, to protect and serve the magical community rather than oppress it. For many of those who had suffered under her rule, her arrest was a moment of vindication, a long-awaited acknowledgement of the injustice they had endured. In the midst of the recovery, it was a reminder that the past could not be forgotten, but that justice, in the end, would be served. Number 17. Gilderoy Lockhart was Hermione's favourite professor. Gilderoy Lockhart, the flamboyant and self-obsessed professor of Defence Against the Dark Arts at Hogwarts, is one of the most intriguing characters in the Harry Potter series. His name might evoke images of a dazzling, charismatic figure, but when we dig deeper into his character, we find something far more complex. Particularly interesting is the fact that Hermione Granger, the brightest and most rational student in her year, was for a time utterly fascinated by Lockhart. This seems almost impossible given her usual sharp intellect and keen ability to spot falsehoods, yet Lockhart's charm and the sheer force of his public persona managed to captivate her. In the books, Hermione's admiration for Lockhart isn't just a passing infatuation, but a significant part of her second year at Hogwarts, and it offers a rich layer to her character development. From the very first moment they meet, Lockhart presents himself as a man of impeccable looks and boundless confidence. He arrives at Hogwarts to teach, as the students are informed, because of his many heroic feats and his success in writing best-selling books about his adventures. His reputation precedes him, and his dazzling smile and polite demeanour only further enhance his image as the hero everyone wishes to be. However, beneath this surface lies a man who is less than honest and far less capable than he lets on. Despite his lack of real talent, Lockhart's ability to weave stories and convince others of his heroism makes him immensely popular, especially with the students. For Hermione, who is often portrayed as studious, intelligent, and grounded in the reality of magical theory and practice, her initial reaction to Lockhart seems out of character. Yet as we learn in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Hermione becomes completely enchanted by him. Throughout much of the book, she speaks of him with great admiration, even going so far as to defend his dubious teaching methods. She gathers his autograph, collects his photos, and even keeps them hidden under her pillow, an action that might seem more fitting for a besotted teenager with little real-world knowledge. The sight of Hermione, usually so logical and skeptical, completely enchanted by Lockhart, provides a striking contrast to her usual demeanour. The reasons for this fascination are multi-layered. Hermione, like many others, is drawn to Lockhart's confident air and the romanticized version of heroism he presents. For a young girl growing up in the often turbulent world of Hogwarts, the idea of a perfect, dashing hero, someone who has supposedly vanquished dangerous creatures, saved lives, and written about his adventures, could seem too good to be true, but also irresistibly attractive. Lockhart, despite his obvious flaws, represents the kind of hero many dream of, effortlessly charming, skilled in the art of storytelling, and, most importantly, adored by the public. His persona is the embodiment of fame, and this allure can be hard to resist, especially for someone as young as Hermione. At the heart of Hermione's admiration lies a desire for validation and a yearning for a more glamorous and adventurous life. As a young witch who excels academically but often struggles with social interactions, she finds in Lockhart a figure who combines charm, fame, and adventure, qualities that resonate deeply with her. His self-assuredness and larger-than-life tales of adventure offer her a glimpse into a world she herself is not yet fully part of. Despite her intelligence, Hermione, like many others, is susceptible to the enchantment of fame. She sees in Lockhart not just a teacher, but a role model, someone whose life seems to be a series of wonderful, heroic escapades, a stark contrast to the more mundane aspects of life at Hogwarts. The deeper Hermione's infatuation grows, the more it showcases her vulnerability. Even though she is able to read people well, there is something about Lockhart's charm that she cannot see through. This is particularly notable when it comes to his lessons. Lockhart's classes are, without a doubt, disastrous. He has no real knowledge of the material he is supposed to teach, often relying on his over-the-top stories rather than practical demonstrations of magical prowess. Yet Hermione continues to support him. She defends his ineptitude to Harry and Ron, who are growing increasingly frustrated with his incompetence. "I think he's brilliant," Hermione says at one point, showcasing her genuine belief in Lockhart's abilities despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Even when Harry and Ron begin to question Lockhart's true character, Hermione refuses to accept that he might not be the hero he claims to be. Her admiration blinds her to his flaws and even to the danger he poses. Throughout much of the book, she justifies his actions and holds firm to her belief that he is the great man he claims to be. It's not until the events surrounding the Chamber of Secrets, when Lockhart's deception is fully exposed, that Hermione is forced to confront the truth about the man she once idolized. However, even in this moment of revelation, Hermione's response is telling. She is deeply hurt, not just because of the exposure of his lies, but because she feels personally betrayed by a figure she had so thoroughly placed on a pedestal. Number 18, Severus Snape was the only one who truly resisted Riddle's curse. In the world of Harry Potter, few characters are as enigmatic and layered as Severus Snape. The potions master at Hogwarts, later revealed to be the head of Slytherin House and a key player in the fight against Lord Voldemort, is often remembered for his complex nature. Among his many roles, one stands out for its unique significance: his tenure as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. This position, according to wizarding legend, was cursed by Lord Voldemort himself after being rejected for the role. The curse, as the story goes, ensured that no one held the post for more than a year. Yet Severus Snape, the man with a reputation for dark and mysterious motives, defied this supposed curse, and in doing so, he accomplished something that no other wizard had managed to do. He was the one who truly resisted the power of Voldemort's dark magic. The legend of the cursed position of Defense Against the Dark Arts professor is widely known. When Tom Riddle, Voldemort in his youth, was denied the post, he supposedly enacted a powerful curse to ensure that anyone who attempted to take the role would meet failure. This curse was a reflection of his anger and desire for control. For years, this curse seemed to hold true. Professors would come and go, but none would last more than a single year. The list of professors, each more desperate than the last, reads like a tragic roll call. But Severus Snape was different. While he technically served for just 1 year as the defense professor, his situation was unique. He did not leave the post in the traditional sense, as his predecessors had. Snape's tenure was not dictated by the curse, but by a much larger plan, one that had been carefully orchestrated by Dumbledore himself. Snape's appointment to the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts professor was not coincidental. In fact, it was part of a strategy that involved the utmost levels of trust and deception. Snape, who had long been serving as a double agent, working both for Voldemort and Dumbledore, had agreed to take the post as a means of advancing his role in the fight against Voldemort. It was no secret that Voldemort valued loyalty above all else, and Snape's willingness to accept the position was a calculated move to cement his place in the Dark Lord's inner circle. As Snape took his place at the front of the classroom, he knew that he was walking a thin line. To Voldemort, Snape had to appear as a loyal follower, someone completely devoted to the Dark Lord's cause. And yet Snape's true allegiance lay with Dumbledore. This tension, the constant balancing act between two powerful figures, was what made Snape's role as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor so crucial. His position, though supposedly cursed, was not one where he could afford to fail. In fact, it was precisely because of his unique understanding of dark magic that he was able to navigate the curse that had driven others away. Throughout the year, Snape remained at Hogwarts teaching students about the dangers of dark magic, all the while keeping his true intentions hidden from the students and the staff. He was, after all, still the same Snape that everyone had come to know, cold, calculating, and fiercely protective of his secrets. Yet beneath this exterior, he was also a man who had dedicated his life to a much larger cause. His role as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor was not about teaching the students of Hogwarts to defend themselves against the dark arts. It was about giving him the tools he needed to stay close to Voldemort and continue to serve Dumbledore. This mission of protecting the wizarding world. The curse of the Defense Against the Dark Arts position had been a symbol of Voldemort's fury, but it was also a reflection of his arrogance. Voldemort, in his twisted mind, believed that he could control everything, even the positions of power within Hogwarts. However, Snape's defiance of this curse was not just a simple matter of breaking a magical bond. It was a reflection of Snape's intellect and cunning, his ability to maneuver within the webs of deceit that Voldemort had created. In a way, Snape was not just defying a curse, he was outsmarting Voldemort's dark magic. Snape's time at Hogwarts as the defense professor was not long, but its impact was profound. He left the position not because the curse drove him away, but because it had fulfilled its purpose. Dumbledore had already known that Snape, his ultimate role, would not be as a teacher, but as a key figure in the fight against Voldemort. Snape's true mission was far greater than anyone could have realized at the time, and it was through his willingness to remain in the role of the defense professor that he had earned Voldemort's trust to the highest degree. By the time Snape left Hogwarts, the trust he had gained was invaluable. He was in a position where he could now make the ultimate sacrifice. The final act in Snape's plan had been set into motion, a plan that involved not only killing Dumbledore, but also ensuring Voldemort's eventual downfall. The deception was complete. Snape had played his part as the loyal follower of Voldemort, and yet he had also ensured that Voldemort's downfall was inevitable. He had won the trust of the Dark Lord, and in doing so, he had positioned himself perfectly to fulfill Dumbledore's wishes. The true genius of Snape's actions lay not just in his ability to resist the curse of the Defense Against the Dark Arts position, but in his ability to play both sides. He had been able to manipulate Voldemort's magic, the very thing that had trapped so many before him, and turn it to his advantage. Snape's success was not just about his skill in the dark arts, but about his unwavering dedication to a cause that no one else fully understood. His actions were the culmination of years of careful planning, and they ultimately led to the defeat of Voldemort. In the end, Snape's legacy was defined not by the curse that had once loomed over the Defense Against the Dark Arts position, but by his incredible ability to deceive, manipulate, and ultimately defeat the dark magic that had once seemed invincible. He had faced the curse head-on and had come out victorious, proving that no matter how dark or powerful the magic, there was always a way to outwit it. Severus Snape was, in every sense of the word, the one who truly resisted Voldemort's dark influence, and in doing so, he cemented his place in history as one of the most complex and brilliant characters in the wizarding world. Number 19. Moody was paranoid long before fourth-year events. Alastor Moody, the legendary Auror, was a figure surrounded by mystery and whispers. Known for his eccentricity and obsession with safety, he was seen as a man who would go to extreme lengths to ensure that no danger ever came near him. However, the truth about his paranoia stretches far beyond his public persona. It began long before the events that saw him as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts, and it became a defining aspect of his life. His fear of betrayal, of those around him turning out to be agents of darkness, was not a recent development. It was something that had shaped his every move for years. The roots of Alastor Moody's paranoia can be traced back to the very beginning of his career as an Auror, when he was involved in the relentless battle against the dark arts. The wizarding world, especially during the height of Lord Voldemort's first rise to power, was filled with treachery, danger, and manipulation. Friends turned on each other, allies betrayed one another, and those who were once trusted allies were often revealed to be Death Eaters in disguise. Moody had seen this betrayal time and time again, and it took a toll on his mind. As a result, Alastor developed an intense distrust of everyone. Even those who appeared to be on his side were potential threats. This mentality became more pronounced as the years wore on, and it wasn't just the large-scale conspiracies he was wary of. It was the small, everyday interactions that raised his suspicions. He was known to watch his colleagues closely, always searching for signs of disloyalty. A wrong glance, a whispered word, or an unexplained movement could all be enough to set him off. His obsession with safety extended to all aspects of his life. He never let his guard down, never allowed himself to relax. One of the most fascinating aspects of Moody's paranoia was how it both saved and doomed him. His constant vigilance allowed him to survive numerous close calls throughout his career. He was always ready, always on the lookout for threats, no matter how small. His magical inventions, like the famous magical eye that allowed him to see through walls and around corners, were a direct result of this mindset. He never trusted anyone enough to let them protect him, so he took it upon himself to ensure that he could see every possible threat coming. This made him one of the most dangerous men in the ministry, and a hero to those who understood the importance of constant vigilance. However, this same paranoia would ultimately be his undoing. It was not the external forces he feared that brought about his downfall, but rather an internal betrayal that caught him off guard. When he took the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts, his obsessive need for control over his own safety seemed more at odds with the trust and responsibility he had to place in others. He was, as always, prepared for every external danger. But when it came to those who were closest to him, he let his guard down in ways that would prove fatal. Barty Crouch Jr., a Death Eater, managed to infiltrate the very institution meant to protect students from the dangers of the dark arts. Using Polyjuice Potion to assume Moody as identity, Crouch was able to deceive everyone at Hogwarts, including the paranoid Auror himself. Moody's vigilance was legendary, and yet it was this very paranoia that blinded him to the possibility that someone inside his own circle, someone within his trusted walls, might be working against him. This lack of trust in others had left him unprepared for a betrayal from within. He had become so accustomed to watching for external threats that he failed to consider that the danger could come from someone in his own home. The night Crouch Jr. captured Moody was a turning point in the story of the former Aura. He had spent decades fearing the world outside his door, obsessively scanning his surroundings for potential threats. Yet he never imagined that someone could enter his house, assume his identity, and trick his closest friends. Moody's paranoia had kept him alive through countless battles, but it was this same paranoia that left him vulnerable when he least expected it. The enemy was not a shadow in the corner of a room, not a lurking figure from the Dark Lord's forces, but someone much closer. Someone who had learned to play on his fears and weaknesses. Moody's downfall was a tragedy of trust. His mind, once a fortress against the horrors of the wizarding world, had become a labyrinth of suspicion and doubt. His inability to trust anyone, to believe in the good in others, meant that he was forever alone in his vigilance. His career had been marked by betrayal and deception, and his survival was built on the foundation of never trusting anyone too much. But in the end, that same mindset led him to miss the one betrayal that mattered, the betrayal of someone who had learned to hide in plain sight. The books often highlight how Alastor Moody was obsessed with his security, and his actions and behavior reflect that obsessive nature. He would go to any lengths to protect himself and others from the danger of the dark arts, even if it meant pushing others away. His life was a series of meticulously crafted plans to ensure his safety, to ensure that no harm would come to him or his comrades. He was a man who had lived through the darkest times in wizarding history, and his fear of those times returning shaped everything he did. However, as the events of the Tri-Wizard tournament unfolded, it became clear that even the most vigilant of protectors are not invincible. It was a bitter irony that Moody, his greatest strength, the ability to sense danger before it arrived, was also the thing that led to his greatest mistake. He had been so focused on keeping external threats at bay that he had failed to notice the threat lurking within the walls of Hogwarts itself. The magical community was full of secrets, and no one knew this better than Moody, but even he could not have anticipated the depths of deception that Barty Crouch Jr. was willing to go to. By the time Moody realized what had happened, it was too late. Crouch Jr. had already manipulated events using the Dark Mark and the Tri-Wizard tournament as a cover to enact his plan. For the first time, Alastor Moody found himself outwitted, outmaneuvered by someone who had been able to hide his true identity for months. And in that moment, Moody's paranoia, which had once kept him alive in the darkest of times, became the thing that sealed his fate. It was a tragic end for a man who had spent his entire life fighting the forces of darkness. Moody was a hero, a survivor, and a symbol of vigilance, but in the end it was the very thing that made him great, his unshakable belief that no one could be trusted, that led to his downfall. His death, though not permanent, left behind a deep sense of loss. For those who knew him, it was a reminder that even the most paranoid and prepared among us are not immune to betrayal, and that sometimes the greatest dangers lie not in the world around us, but in the shadows we refuse to acknowledge within. Alastor Moody's life and death remain a testament to the idea that trust, while difficult to give, is often the one thing that keeps us from falling into the trap of our own fears. In the end, no amount of vigilance could protect him from the one thing he could never have prepared for: betrayal from within. Number 20. Quirrell wore his turban for a made-up reason. Professor Quirrell, the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher in Harry Potter's first year at Hogwarts, is one of the most fascinating characters in the series. His quirky mannerisms and peculiar habits had a deeper, darker reason behind them than anyone could have ever imagined. One such detail that fascinated readers and viewers alike was his ever-present turban. To the casual observer, it seemed like a simple fashion choice or perhaps an eccentricity, but the true reason for Quirrell's turban was far more sinister and intricate than initially appeared. The movie adaptation of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone provided an explanation that was simple yet impactful. Quirrell wore the turban to hide the dark, grotesque face of Voldemort, who was living on the back of his head. However, J.K. Rowling's books offer additional layers of deception which reveal just how far Quirrell was willing to go to hide the truth. In the films, it's clear that the turban served as a cover for Voldemort's existence, with the Dark Lord's face nestled against Quirrell's skull, an unholy parasite that controlled much of his actions. The visual of Voldemort's face in the back of Quirrell's head, trying desperately to communicate with Harry, created an eerie image that added to the suspense of the first story. But while the films provided a simple narrative, the books delved deeper into the backstory of the turban and Quirrell as an attempt to conceal his dark secret. In J.K. Rowling's version, Quirrell didn't just wear the turban to cover a horrifying truth. He crafted an elaborate, fabricated story to explain the reason behind it. Quirrell claimed that the turban was a gift from an African prince, whom he had allegedly saved from a horde of zombies. The prince, in gratitude, had given him this mystical item to honor his bravery. According to Quirrell, the turban was not just a piece of clothing, but a magical artifact that had the ability to ward off evil creatures, particularly vampires. In fact, during his classes, Quirrell would often bring up this story and even use garlic to further strengthen the illusion that he was using the turban to protect himself from dark forces. This strange and seemingly unrelated detail in Quirrell's character, his insistence on the turban's magical properties, was part of an elaborate web of lies that he constructed to prevent others from discovering the true horror that was lurking inside him. This story about the African prince and the turban's protective qualities was, of course, entirely fabricated. The turban itself, as we come to learn, was the means by which Quirrell hid Voldemort. The Dark Lord was not simply a distant influence on Quirrell, but a physical presence, taking up residence in his body. Quirrell, fully aware of the danger of revealing this truth, went to great lengths to distract those around him from the reality of his situation. His eccentric behavior, combined with his far-fetched tale, kept people from questioning the obvious signs of his troubled mind. The lengths to which Quirrell was willing to go to maintain his facade were not limited to the turban or his fabricated story. His behavior in class and his interactions with students were equally odd, as if he was constantly hiding something. Harry Potter, the young protagonist of the series, was particularly sensitive to these nuances. In Harry's first year, he could tell that Quirrell was not a normal teacher and something was off. His frequent stammering, nervous tics and inability to hold eye contact were not merely traits of a shy man, but symptoms of a much darker truth. Quirrell was battling with a dark force that had taken hold of him. The turban was just one manifestation of this internal conflict, a symbol of the far more sinister events unfolding behind the scenes. The complexity of Quirrell's character lies in how deep his deception went. Not only did he invent the tale of the African prince, but he also believed it to be true, or at least convinced himself that it was the only story that could justify his strange behavior. His attachment to the lie became so ingrained that it allowed him to carry out Voldemort's bidding without ever fully confronting the horror of what he had become. Quirrell's inability to break free from Voldemort's control makes his character tragic in a sense. He was not simply an evil person, but rather a man whose own identity had been subsumed by the Dark Lord's malevolent presence. What makes this deception so powerful is how it highlights Quirrell's desperation to avoid suspicion. Throughout the book, he goes to extreme lengths to avoid scrutiny from others. When Harry questions him about the turban, Quirrell quickly dismisses the inquiry and steers the conversation away from his personal life. He was fully aware that any hint of suspicion could lead to his undoing. This paranoid behavior only reinforced his need for the turban and the lies he told to cover up the truth. The deeper the lie, the more Quirrell believed in it, and the more impossible it seemed to escape the consequences of his actions. The turban, then, is not just a physical object. It represents the mental and emotional strain Quirrell underwent as he tried to hold on to his own sense of self while being overtaken by Voldemort Aulgary's power. His decision to wear it was not one of choice but of survival. He had no other option but to hide the truth from those around him, and the turban became his armor, not just against physical threats, but against the psychological threat of being discovered. The irony, of course, is that Quirrell's greatest fear, being exposed, was what eventually led to his downfall. The very thing he feared most was what ultimately led to the unraveling of his carefully crafted story. Harry's role in the unraveling of Quirrell's secrets is pivotal. While Quirrell's story about the turban was an excellent cover, Harry's direct confrontation with him exposed the true horror. When Harry finally discovered the face of Voldemort on the back of Quirrell's head, it was the culmination of all of Quirrell's lies coming to fruition. The innocent and naive young boy had unwittingly become the key to unveiling Quirrell's dark secrets. The fact that Quirrell was unable to stop Harry, despite all his years of magical training and his association with the Dark Lord, speaks to the ultimate futility of his lies. Voldemort's presence in his life had reduced him to a mere puppet, unable to break free from the control of the very evil he had sought to serve. The complexity of Quirrell's character also lies in his own internal struggle. It's clear that he wasn't entirely evil or malicious in his motivations. Rather, he was a man caught in a situation far beyond his control. The magical power of Voldemort was so overwhelming that it consumed Quirrell entirely, leaving him a shell of the person he once was. His stories about the turban and his strange behavior were not just defenses against others, but also the only means he had of coping with the darkness that had taken over his life. It is a sad irony that Quirrell's attempts to hide the truth only served to draw more attention to his instability. Quirrell's story is a tragic one. It serves as a reminder that even the most elaborate lies cannot protect a person from the truth. No matter how hard Quirrell tried to disguise his reality, he could not escape the monstrous truth that Voldemort lived within him. The turban, initially a shield from suspicion, became a symbol of his ultimate failure to protect himself from the darkness that had consumed him. The lies he told were not just about a turban, they were about his very identity, a desperate attempt to retain some semblance of control in a world where he had lost it entirely. In the end, Quirrell's story is not just one of deception, but of desperation and hopelessness. His attempts to hide the truth only reveal the depth of his internal torment and the extent to which he was willing to go to conceal his fate. The turban was just one piece of the puzzle, a small part of the larger picture of a man who had lost himself to the darkness, unable to break free. Number 21. Barty Crouch Jr. introduced real reforms to the curriculum. In the halls of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where dark forces frequently shadow the lives of students, few names stand out with as much notoriety and irony as that of Bartemius Crouch Jr., a Death Eater whose very presence in the world of magic seemed to be tied to the darkest of forces. Crouch's time as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor was both controversial and surprisingly effective. It was in the persona of Mad-Eye Moody, a role he assumed under an elaborate deception, that Crouch Jr. left an indelible mark on the school. His teaching methods, though dangerous and manipulative, were uncommonly successful in preparing students for the harsh realities of dark magic and the coming war. While his methods might have been rooted in a desire to prepare students for his own cause, they inadvertently gave the young witches and wizards a deeper understanding of the dark arts than any other professor in the history of the subject. For students such as Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley, his lessons were a far cry from the theoretical and often overly cautious teachings of past instructors. What they experienced under Mad-Eye Moody's instruction was a no-holds-barred approach to defense against the dark arts, one that would, ironically, prepare them better for the conflict ahead than they could have ever imagined. Crouch Jr.'s first lesson to the class was a powerful demonstration of the Cruciatus Curse, one of the 3 unforgivable curses. He showed them the potency of the curse in a way no textbook ever could. The way he used the curse to torture an innocent spider in front of his students, though deeply unsettling, made it crystal clear what the dangers of dark magic were. For many students, this marked a turning point in their understanding of the gravity of their studies. No longer were they just learning spells in the safety of the classroom. They were witnessing firsthand the real-world implications of what it meant to wield such power. Though the classroom was filled with tension, Crouch Jr.'s lessons on the unforgivable curses were not without purpose. He taught them not just how to recognize these dark spells, but how to defend themselves against them. This was a stark contrast to the teachings of previous Defense Against the Dark Arts professors, who often focused on theory and spells that were less likely to be used in a real confrontation. Crouch's approach, which was both shocking and brutal, was exactly what many of the students needed in the shadow of the growing threat of Voldemort's return. It was a cold, practical preparation for the very real battles that lay ahead. In addition to the curses, Crouch introduced his students to defensive spells that were far more advanced than what they had previously encountered. The students learned how to cast protective charms that were more nuanced and versatile than the usual shield charm. They were taught how to counter dark magic with precision, not just by relying on instinct, but by understanding the true mechanics of each spell. It was here, under Crouch Jr.'s guidance, that Harry first learned how to properly shield himself from dark magic. He was also exposed to the terrifying world of magical creatures such as the Boggart, and how to use one's inner fears to outwit even the most fearsome beasts. It was not just the students' skills with wands that were improved. Crouch, as teachings extended to mental fortitude as well, he drilled into them the importance of staying calm under pressure, teaching them to respond to danger, not with panic, but with controlled precision. This mental resilience would become invaluable in the months and years to come as the wizarding world was plunged into the chaos of war. As time went on, the students became increasingly aware of the contradictions that surrounded their teacher. It was clear that Mad-Eye Moody was not the same man they had read about in history books or heard whispered about in the halls of Hogwarts. He was harsher, more ruthless, and far more intense than any previous professor. However, there were those who still had reservations about his methods. Hermione Granger, who was often the voice of reason in the trio, initially struggled with the brutality of the lessons, but even she could not deny the effectiveness of Crouch's approach. Her reservations gradually gave way to a grudging respect for the practical skills they were gaining. She was quick to recognize that this was not ordinary training. This was the kind of preparation that would save their lives when the war finally came. For Ron Weasley, the impact was even more personal. Having grown up with the fear of never being good enough, Ron found that Crouch's unorthodox methods brought out a strength in him he didn't know he had. He was pushed harder than ever before, and though he initially balked at the intensity of the lessons, he soon realized that it was exactly what he needed. It was through Crouch's teaching that Ron learned how to be more decisive in battle, taking the lessons of self-confidence to heart in a way that would prove crucial in the battles to come. While many students came to appreciate Crouch's approach to teaching, there was a darker, more unsettling undercurrent to his presence. The truth about his identity, which was unbeknownst to the students for much of the year, painted a chilling picture. Bartemius Crouch Jr. was a Death Eater, an ardent supporter of Lord Voldemort who had been responsible for the torture and deaths of countless innocent people. His infiltration of the Hogwarts staff was a calculated move to ensure that the next generation of witches and wizards would be prepared to serve the Dark Lord and rise to power. But Crouch's own twisted sense of loyalty to Voldemort was not the only reason he pushed his students so hard. Beneath the facade of his role as a teacher was a man determined to create soldiers for a war that was already underway. Crouch's obsession with preparing his students for combat, while undeniably effective, also had a deeper purpose. It was a way for him to feel in control of the situation. As the war approached, Crouch's own uncertainty about his place in Voldemort, New Order seemed to translate into his teaching. He needed to prove his worth, to prove that his methods could be the key to victory in the coming conflict. His lessons, while harsh, gave students the kind of knowledge that would make them indispensable in the fight against the forces of darkness. For Harry Potter, the lessons he learned from Crouch were critical in shaping his approach to the challenges he would face in the final battle against Voldemort. While Harry did not know it at the time, the skills he honed under Crouch's tutelage particularly his ability to defend against dark magic, would serve him well in the coming years. The bravery and resilience instilled in him by Crouch, his lessons were the foundation upon which Harry would later build his own success. Yet, despite all the practical benefits that came from Crouch, his teaching, the truth about his motives remained hidden. Crouch, in his twisted way, had succeeded in preparing his students for war, but at what cost? The very methods that made him an effective teacher were also the ones that made him a dangerous figure. The students learned how to fight, how to protect themselves, and how to face the darkness, but they also learned that in times of war, there are no simple answers, and sometimes the lessons that prepare you for battle come from the darkest of sources. In the end, while Bartemius Crouch Jr. may have been one of the most controversial and unexpected figures in the history of Hogwarts, his time as a teacher had a lasting impact on those who lived through it. It was a cruel irony that a Death Eater, one of the very agents of darkness, became the teacher who prepared a generation of students for the fight against the very evil he served. Number 22, Umbridge banned the use of wands during class. Dolores Umbridge's tenure as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts stands as one of the most depressive periods in the school's history. Her approach to teaching was infamously harsh and authoritarian, yet perhaps her most controversial rule was her outright ban on the use of wands during her lessons. This decision, so stark in its disregard for the very essence of magical learning, is a point of significant discussion in both J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter books, and the film adaptation. While the movies portray Umbridge's ban on combat spells, the books delve deeper into this policy, revealing its true extent. In the text, Umbridge forbids students from using their wands altogether during class. The result was a shift in the dynamic of magical education, one that led to the formation of Dumbledore's army and set the stage for a rebellion against the Ministry of Magic's growing tyranny. The method of teaching employed by Dolores Umbridge was cold, rigid, and unyielding. She believed that students should read about magic, learn theory, and memorize spells rather than practice them. In her mind, knowledge was best absorbed through the written word and discussion, not through the messy, potentially dangerous application of magic. As she declared, "I'm sure you will all find your textbooks absolutely fascinating if you read them properly." But the consequences of this policy were profound. Instead of practicing spells with their wands, students were relegated to simply reading about them and discussing theoretical scenarios. The result was a stagnant learning environment, devoid of excitement, passion, or genuine magical growth. The idea of banning the use of wands in a class that was supposed to be about defending oneself against dark forces was, of course, absurd. Defense against the dark arts, by its very nature, was a subject meant to equip young witches and wizards with the skills to protect themselves against evil. Yet Umbridge stripped away the very tools they would need to defend themselves, creating a paradox where the students were learning nothing of practical value. They were deprived of the hands-on experience essential for mastering the art of self-defense. For example, when Harry Potter tried to demonstrate the disarming charm, Umbridge coldly reprimanded him. She didn't care about the importance of the spell or the student's needs to practice. She cared about control, authority, and maintaining the ministry's stance on education. The effect this ban had on the students was disastrous. Magic was, for most young wizards, a source of joy, curiosity, and discovery. To be told they couldn't use their wands felt like an act of betrayal. For students like Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley, it was a stark reminder of how far the Ministry had gone in trying to control every aspect of their lives. They were, in many ways, being taught to suppress their natural abilities. In Harry's case, this was especially infuriating because, as the only student with experience facing dark forces, he knew better than anyone the importance of practicing magic in real-world conditions. It was also a dehumanizing experience. Imagine sitting in a classroom full of young witches and wizards who were all too aware of their own potential, their magical power, yet forced to sit passively with their hands on their desks, reading dry textbook passages about magic they were unable to wield. This stark contrast between what they were capable of and what they were allowed to do added to the resentment building among the students. Even Hermione Granger, who was usually patient and disciplined, found herself deeply frustrated with Umbridge's method of instruction. "This is ridiculous," she muttered once, unable to contain her irritation. "We couldn't even practice a spell when we'd supposed to be learning how to defend ourselves." Or it wasn't just the students' emotions that were impacted by this restrictive teaching style. It also significantly affected their sense of safety. At the time, Voldemort was slowly regaining power, and the magical world was becoming increasingly dangerous. The idea that students, who were already at risk of encountering dark forces, were being denied the opportunity to practice real defense spells was shocking. The fact that they were not even allowed to hold their wands in a class about protection from dark magic spoke volumes about Umbridge's priorities. She was not interested in their safety, she was interested in maintaining her own power. This policy sparked an underground rebellion of sorts led by Harry Potter himself. Disillusioned by Umbridge's teaching methods and the Ministry's increasing control over Hogwarts, Harry, Hermione, and Ron took matters into their own hands. They formed Dumbledore's Army, a secret student group dedicated to learning and practicing real magic. While the students were forbidden from using their wands in Umbridge's class, they were free to do so in the Room of Requirement, where Harry taught them how to properly defend themselves. The formation of the group was a direct response to the oppressive atmosphere created by Umbridge policies. In essence, the students were fighting back against a system that sought to stifle their education and deny them the tools they needed to survive. Umbridge's ban on wands can also be seen as a metaphor for the broader political situation in the wizarding world. The Ministry of Magic, through her actions, was attempting to suppress the truth, deny the reality of the growing threat of Voldemort, and control the flow of knowledge. By restricting the use of wands, the Ministry hoped to control the students' understanding of magic, just as it sought to control the narrative around Voldemort's return. The students, through Dumbledore's Army, were essentially creating an alternative educational system, one that focused on real-world applications of magic rather than the government-sanitized, politically correct version of magical education. For some students, Umbridge's ban on wands became the catalyst for a deeper understanding of the need to stand up against oppressive authority. Harry, in particular, learned valuable lessons about leadership, resilience, and the importance of resistance. He also saw the importance of education as a means of empowerment. Through his efforts to teach his peers in Dumbledore's Army, he became not just a student but also a teacher, guiding others through the process of learning magic in a way that felt real and meaningful. There was, of course, the added irony that Umbridge strict control over the classroom, had the opposite effect of what she intended. Instead of creating a compliant, docile group of students, she unknowingly pushed them toward rebellion. Her attempt to suppress magic only made the students more determined to learn it. By forbidding them from using their wands, she turned them into more active participants in the fight for freedom. One of the most important things that Dumbledore's army represented was a sense of unity. Students from different houses who would normally be at odds with one another came together to learn from Harry and each other. They realized that Umbridge's control over the classroom was just one part of a much larger issue, the Ministry's attempt to control their lives. They were not just learning magic, they were learning how to stand up for what was right, even when those in power tried to prevent them from doing so. In the end, Umbridge's attempt to restrict the students' education, to deny them the right to use their wands, became one of the most significant catalysts for the eventual downfall of the Ministry's grip on Hogwarts. Her oppressive methods only fueled the fire of rebellion, which ultimately led to the students' triumph. This was not just a victory in the classroom, but a triumph of the spirit, a triumph of resistance against a system that sought to control them. And all of this, ironically, was made possible by Umbridge's own misguided policies. Number 23, Snape used his lessons to suppress Harry. Severus Snape, a complex and enigmatic figure in the Harry Potter series, was undoubtedly a skilled wizard, particularly when it came to the dark arts. He was a master of potions, a highly respected member of the Slytherin house, and a double agent during the First and Second Wizarding Wars. However, despite his undeniable talents and his secret role as a protector of Harry Potter, Snape's behavior as the Professor of Defense Against the Dark Arts was far from admirable. His interactions with Harry, in particular, reveal a much darker side of his personality, one marked by bitterness, jealousy, and resentment. It is in these moments that the reader begins to see the true extent of Snape's troubled relationship with Harry, which was shaped by years of history, pain, and personal vendettas. During Harry's 6th year at Hogwarts, Snape had finally achieved his long-desired position as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Though one might assume he would approach his new role with professionalism, Snape seemed to take every opportunity to use his position as a way to humiliate and undermine Harry. It was clear from the beginning that Snape had no interest in teaching Harry or any other student for the sake of their improvement. His lectures, instead of being focused on developing the students' skills in defense against dark magic, often turned into a platform for Snape to exercise his authority and to indulge in his personal vendettas. One of the most significant examples of Snape's malicious behavior occurs in, I quote, 36I, during one of Harry's lessons in defense against the dark arts. In this lesson, Snape uses a potion to create a situation in which Harry is forced to relive some of his most painful memories. Rather than offering guidance or constructive criticism, Snape takes sadistic pleasure in tormenting Harry, using the lesson to remind him of his father, his legacy, the one person Harry never seemed to fully reconcile with. Snape's clear animosity toward Harry comes through in his condescending tone and the way he manipulates the lesson to create uncomfortable situations for the young wizard. The other students were oblivious to Snape's motives, but Harry could feel the underlying tension, knowing that Snape was not teaching for the sake of his students, but using the opportunity to strike at him emotionally. It is not just during lessons that Snape as personal animosity toward Harry surfaces. In private moments, the reader sees Snape bitter feelings toward Harry seeping into every interaction. For example, when Harry seeks help in potions, Snape is quick to rebuff him instead of offering the guidance that any teacher should. Snape's role as a professor seems less about teaching and more about wielding power over Harry, even to the point of belittling his abilities. Snape's bitterness is rooted not only in the long-standing rivalry between Slytherins and Gryffindors, but also in the deep personal wounds left by his past. His hatred for Harry seemed to go beyond simple dislike. It was a manifestation of his unresolved anger at the legacy of Harry's father, James Potter, who, in Snape's eyes, had humiliated him during their time at Hogwarts. In one notable moment, Snape uses his position as the professor to further his agenda against Harry. When Harry is attempting to use his skill as an occlumens, Snape takes advantage of Harry's vulnerability by invading his mind. Instead of offering guidance on how to strengthen Harry's mind against the forces of darkness, Snape revels in Harry's discomfort. The lesson becomes an opportunity for Snape to wield power over Harry, putting the young wizard in a state of emotional distress while offering no real help. While this moment is presented as a necessary step for Harry's development, it is evident that Snape's enjoyment of the exercise comes from something more personal than his desire to teach. Furthermore, Snape's treatment of Harry is not just about belittling him during class or using his emotions against him. Snape also seeks to undermine Harry's self-confidence and place in Hogwarts. When Harry attempts to explain his achievements, Snape dismisses them with sarcasm and disdain. His arrogance and pride, which were deeply tied to his identity as a Slytherin, led him to consistently put Harry down in front of his classmates, disregarding the fact that Harry was trying to do the right thing. Snape's hostility toward Harry is often expressed in small but significant ways. His refusal to acknowledge Harry's accomplishments, his sharp remarks designed to humiliate, and his general lack of empathy toward the young wizard. This behavior would later be revealed as stemming from his overwhelming jealousy and personal vendetta. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Snape's complex emotions toward Harry begin to unfold in a more nuanced way. The reader begins to understand that Snape's hostility, while rooted in his history with James Potter, also comes from his own deep-seated emotional scars. Snape's hatred of Harry is not simply a one-dimensional act of malice. It is part of a much larger web of pain, regret, and guilt that has been building for years. As the story progresses, the layers of Snape's character begin to unravel, showing that his animosity toward Harry is not entirely based on a desire to punish the boy for his father's past wrongs. Rather, Snape's actions are driven by a much more complex set of emotions, his own unresolved feelings of inadequacy, loss, and fear. Despite Snape's attempts to suppress his emotions, they continue to influence his behavior in subtle ways. As much as he tried to mask his true feelings, Snape's bitterness toward Harry remained evident in his every action. This was particularly clear when Snape was forced to confront the reality of his role as a double agent. The guilt and shame that weighed on Snape caused him to lash out in moments of weakness, and Harry, as his pupil, became an easy target for his frustrations. Harry, still unaware of the full extent of Snape's role in the ongoing war, was left to navigate this complex and often hostile environment without understanding the motivations behind Snape's actions. While Snape's behavior as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor may have seemed purely cruel on the surface, there is a deeper layer of complexity beneath it. As the series progresses, the reader learns that Snape's actions toward Harry were not entirely driven by malice, but rather by the internal struggle between his personal pain and his sense of duty. His constant undermining of Harry was a reflection of his internal battle, a battle that would ultimately lead to his tragic fate. However, this does not excuse the way Snape treated Harry, nor does it diminish the impact of his actions on the young wizard's emotional well-being. The portrayal of Snape's relationship with Harry throughout the series highlights the tension between professional responsibility and personal conflict. As a teacher, Snape had the power to shape Harry's future, and yet he used that power to suppress him rather than nurture his growth. This was a direct reflection of Snape's inability to reconcile his past with his present, as well as his deep-seated resentment toward Harry. Despite his profound skill and the important role he played in the fight against Voldemort, Snape's behavior as the Professor of Defense Against the Dark Arts was far from exemplary. His personal demons and unresolved grievances continually disrupted his ability to be the mentor Harry needed, leaving a lasting impression on both the young wizard and the reader alike. Number 24, Amicus Carrow personally tortured students. Ammius Carrow, the cruel and sadistic Professor of Defense Against the Dark Arts, was a key figure in the final year of Harry Potter, his education at Hogwarts. His reign over the students during the rise of Voldemort's influence over the wizarding world was one of fear, pain, and oppressive terror. Although the film adaptation of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows hardly delves into the brutal nature of Carrow's lessons, the book paints a chilling picture of the kind of environment he created. As a teacher, he wasn't merely interested in imparting knowledge, he was obsessed with cruelty and power, and his lessons were nothing short of torture. In the final year at Hogwarts, the Ministry of Magic had fallen under the control of Voldemort and his Death Eaters. The school, once a place of learning and camaraderie, was now a breeding ground for fear and submission. The Defense Against the Dark Arts curriculum had always been one of the most important and dynamic subjects at Hogwarts, but under Carrow's reign, it turned into an exercise in terror. Rather than teaching students how to protect themselves from dark magic, Carrow twisted the subject into a vehicle for inflicting suffering. One of the most horrifying aspects of his lessons was his insistence on making students practice the Cruciatus Curse. This curse, one of the unforgivable curses, causes unbearable pain and suffering to the victim. In the book, it is clear that Carrow's twisted view of education involved forcing students to use the curse on each other. He had been told to demonstrate on someone, reads the narrative. This twisted desire to see his students inflict pain on each other made his lessons not only dangerous but morally corrupt. The very act of using the Cruciatus Curse, which is so inherently evil, on fellow students, created an atmosphere of betrayal and torment. Neville Longbottom, a character who has grown significantly throughout the series, became an unwitting hero during this dark period at Hogwarts. As the story unfolds, Neville begins to take on the role of leader in the underground resistance against the Death Eaters. But his position came at a price. The terrible pressure and emotional cost were evident. Every time Neville refused to comply with Carrow's commands to curse his peers, he became the target of Carrow's wrath. The cruel professor subjected Neville to the Cruciatus Curse repeatedly, tormenting him in front of the entire class. One of the most memorable moments of Neville suffering comes when Carrow targets him for his defiance. Neville Longbottom had not yet mastered the art of learning the dark arts the book describes. Carrow's punishment for this was to perform the Cruciatus Curse on him time and time again. Despite the physical pain and humiliation, Neville endured these punishments with a resilience that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. His bravery in the face of such torture only strengthened his resolve to fight back. But Carrow, sadism wasn't limited to Neville alone. Other students who showed signs of resistance or reluctance to perform dark magic found themselves in similar situations. Carrow turned Hogwarts into a battleground, a place where fear ruled, and every lesson was a test of one, as loyalty to the Dark Lord. Carrow's cruelty didn't stop at the Cruciatus Curse. His behavior extended to physically abusing students, further solidifying his reputation as a tyrant within the school. The book describes how Carrow would strike students without hesitation, his violent tendencies becoming a regular feature of his teaching style. His physical violence was a clear message to the students. Compliance meant survival, while disobedience would be met with painful consequences. Even students who were otherwise able to avoid the Cruciatus Curse were not safe from his wrath. For Carrow, every student was either a tool to be used or a target to be destroyed. There was no room for empathy, no space for kindness. The teachers at Hogwarts, such as Professor McGonagall, seemed powerless to protect the students from Carrow's reign of terror. The school had been transformed into a place where the rules were written by fear. The headmaster, Severus Snape, had a reputation for being a disciplinarian, but under his watch, Carrow was allowed to unleash his brutality unchecked. Snape's alignment with the Death Eaters gave him an immunity that made it almost impossible for the students to escape his terror. Although McGonagall and others tried to protect the students in subtle ways, it was clear that the Death Eaters held a firm grip on the school's atmosphere. The culmination of Carrow's reign of terror came when he used the power of fear to manipulate the students into becoming willing instruments of the Dark Lord's will. He knew that breaking a spirit, was the surest way to control them. By forcing them to participate in cruel acts and submitting them to unrelenting punishments, Carrow destroyed any sense of trust or camaraderie between the students. The very idea of unity was shattered under the weight of his sadistic methods. But perhaps the most disturbing part of Carrow's methods was the way he exploited the vulnerability of the students. Hogwarts had always been a place of learning and friendship, where students could rely on each other for support. Carrow, however, knew that the more isolated the students became, the more powerful he would be. By making them hurt each other, he ensured that the bonds of friendship were fractured and replaced by suspicion and fear. The classroom became a place of cruelty, where survival meant sacrificing your integrity for the sake of avoiding pain. One of the key themes of this period in Hogwarts is the transformation of the school from a place of sanctuary to a zone of oppression. The students' lives were no longer their own, as they were subjected to the whims of the Death Eaters. Carrow embodied this transformation completely. He was not just a teacher who enforced rules, he was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in the wizarding world. Under his influence, the once vibrant halls of Hogwarts became a prison. The lessons became more about survival than learning. Despite the constant threat of punishment, a small group of students, led by Neville, fought back in any way they could. They managed to gather enough support to form an underground resistance, one that was focused on fighting against the Death Eaters and their cruelty. The idea of standing up to Caro, despite the enormous risk, became a beacon of hope for the students. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that even in the darkest times there was still a flicker of resistance. Caro, however, was not simply an enemy to be overcome. He was a reflection of the larger darkness that had overtaken the wizarding world. His actions were not just the result of a desire for personal power, they were part of a larger, more insidious plan to reshape society. He sought to destroy the very fabric of what made Hogwarts a safe place for young witches and wizards. He wanted to ensure that the next generation of magical beings would grow up in a world where fear ruled and morality had no place. In the end, Caro's legacy was one of terror, but also one of resistance. Despite the years of suffering he inflicted, his reign was ultimately broken by the determination and bravery of the students who fought back. Though he caused immeasurable pain, he also inadvertently sparked the resistance that would eventually lead to the downfall of Voldemort and his followers. The story of Caro's time at Hogwarts is one of both horror and hope, a reminder of the resilience of young people who refused to be cowed by oppression. Even in the darkest times, there is always a spark of rebellion that can light the way to freedom. Number 25, Lupin wanted to stay at Hogwarts despite being dismissed. Remus Lupin's tenure as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor at Hogwarts was not just a remarkable chapter in the series, it also became a moment of poignant tragedy for a character who had long been an outcast in the wizarding world. While the films present Lupin's departure from Hogwarts as a calm and dignified exit, where he seems to quietly accept his fate, the books reveal a much more complex and emotional struggle. After being unmasked as a werewolf, Lupin's forced resignation from his beloved position at Hogwarts was not simply an inevitable decision born out of the necessity of hiding his true nature. Instead, it marked a crushing defeat for Lupin, whose greatest desire was to remain in the school that had, for the first time in his life, offered him a semblance of belonging and acceptance. Lupin's feelings upon learning of Dumbledore's decision to remove him were far from the composed resignation portrayed in the films. The reality was far more heartbreaking. When Lupin was told that he could no longer remain at Hogwarts due to his condition, the emotional blow was immediate and profound. In his mind, he had already found his place, not just in the wizarding world, but in the hearts of the students he taught. He had finally found a role that suited him, a purpose that allowed him to use his knowledge and skills for the greater good. However, the revelation of his lycanthropy shattered that dream. It wasn't just the fact that he had to leave Hogwarts that hurt, it was the sense of failure and rejection that overwhelmed him. Lupin had always been keenly aware of his place in the world, or rather, his lack of place. As a child, he had been shunned and ostracized because of his condition. People saw his lycanthropy as something to be feared, something to be hidden. Even in the wizarding world where magic was commonplace, his condition rendered him a pariah. His time as a student at Hogwarts had not been easy, and despite the comfort of the school's welcoming environment, he still felt the sting of his condition setting him apart from others. That sense of alienation stayed with him throughout his life, even as he became an adult and took on the role of teacher. When Dumbledore offered him the position of Defense Against the Dark Arts Professor, it was not just a job for Lupin, it was a chance for him to belong. In that moment, he finally felt useful, accepted, and appreciated. For the first time, he saw himself as more than just a man with a curse. He saw himself as a mentor, a guide, and an individual who had something valuable to offer. The students loved him, and he reciprocated that affection. He cherished the opportunity to teach them and pass on his extensive knowledge of dark creatures and the defense against them. He was, in his own mind, the best man for the job. His lessons were engaging, practical, and unique, thanks to his own personal experience with the dangers of dark creatures, including the werewolves. However, all of this came crashing down when the truth about Lupin's condition was revealed to the school. The students, who had admired him so much, were suddenly confronted with the reality of his lycanthropy. While many of them were sympathetic, others were fearful, influenced by the pervasive stigma surrounding werewolves in the wizarding world. The parents of the students, who had already been concerned about the potential dangers of having a werewolf as a teacher, demanded that Lupin be dismissed. And despite his deep connection to the students and the school, Lupin found himself being ousted once again. The most painful aspect of Lupin's resignation was not the external pressure from the parents or even the official decision made by Dumbledore. It was the emotional weight of the situation that truly devastated him. Despite everything, Lupin still hoped, desperately hoped, that Dumbledore would find a way to keep him at Hogwarts. He understood the situation all too well, but the idea of losing the one place that had given him solace and purpose was unbearable. He had fought so hard to overcome his inner demons and finally carve out a life for himself, and now it seemed as though all of that had been taken away from him in an instant. This tragedy is underscored by Lupin's realization that despite his best efforts and his deep connection to his students, he was still seen as someone to be feared and cast out. His resignation was not just about a job, it was about his own sense of self-worth. He had been accepted, even loved by the students and by Dumbledore, yet in the eyes of society he remained nothing more than a monster. This internal conflict tore at him, as he had no way of reconciling his desire to stay with the reality of his condition. His longing to remain at Hogwarts was not born out of a simple attachment to the position or to his students, but rather a deeper yearning for a place where he could be whole, where his lycanthropy would no longer define him. In the aftermath of his resignation, Lupin did not simply move on with his life. Instead, he withdrew into himself, his heart weighed down by the loss of a dream he had held on to for so long. While he eventually took on other roles, such as working with the Order of the Phoenix, it was clear that his heart was no longer fully in these endeavors. His time at Hogwarts had been the pinnacle of his existence, the one time when he could truly be himself and make a meaningful contribution to the world. Losing that for Lupin was akin to losing a part of his soul. One of the most telling moments in Lupin's character arc is the quiet resignation that accompanies his departure from Hogwarts. While others might have expected him to be angry or resentful, Lupin's response is more tragic in its quiet acceptance. His hope that Dumbledore might find a way to keep him was dashed, and instead of a dramatic confrontation, Lupin simply leaves the school, heartbroken but resigned. This speaks volumes about his character, the man who had spent so long trying to be accepted, and yet, when faced with the harsh reality of his situation, could only retreat into the shadows once again. Lupin's resignation also speaks to the broader themes of the series, particularly the idea of the outsider. Throughout the books we see characters who are marginalized for one reason or another, whether it is Harry's struggle with being an orphan, Hermione's challenges as a Muggle-born, or Lupin's constant battle with his lycanthropy. These characters all face prejudice and exclusion, yet they continue to fight for a place in the world. Lupin's story, however, is one of the most tragic examples of this struggle, as it highlights how even the most deserving individuals can be cast aside due to factors beyond their control. Despite all of this, Lupin's legacy at Hogwarts remains. His lessons continue to resonate with his students, many of whom carry the memory of his kindness, his competence, and his willingness to fight for what was right. His time at Hogwarts, though brief, had a lasting impact, and in the hearts of those who truly knew him, he was always remembered not for his condition, but for his character. His departure, though painful, did not erase the mark he left on the school or on the hearts of his students. Ultimately, Lupin's story is one of missed opportunities and unfulfilled potential. He was a man who had spent his life hiding from the world, and just as he began to find acceptance, it was ripped away from him. His desire to remain at Hogwarts was not simply about the job, but about finding a place where he could belong, a place where his identity as a werewolf would not define him. In the end, however, he learned that even in a world filled with magic and wonder, there are still limits to how much acceptance a person can receive. And for Remus Lupin, that realization was a deeply painful one. Number 26. Lockhart planned to write a book about Harry. When Zwartopus Lockons met Harry Potter in St. Mungo's hospital, he couldn't have known that this would be the turning point in his life, a turning point that would spur him to write yet another book, despite the amnesia that had taken hold of him. The encounter was anything but ordinary, and it was something that Lockons would never forget. The magical world, after all, was rife with strange happenings and extraordinary characters. However, what particularly struck Lockons about Harry was the attention he received from the doctors and other patients at the hospital. It was as though Harry had a magnetic pull that made everyone around him treat him with reverence, even when they didn't know who he was. It was this unexpected moment that sparked an idea in the mind of the forgotten professor. At first, Lockons barely registered the significance of his surroundings. He had not known who he was for a long time, and yet the sight of the boy who lived, so revered by the wizarding world, ignited something in him. Harry's very presence made him feel like a part of something important once more. It wasn't just that Harry had survived the terrible events surrounding Lord Voldemort, it was the way people treated him. Harry was someone who commanded attention. And Lockons, in his typical manner, felt an immediate urge to be a part of that attention. Lockons, despite his own struggles, couldn't help but notice how the doctors and nurses moved around Harry in a state of awe. They seemed to know on some deep level that this young boy had survived the impossible. The way they spoke to him, the way they helped him with every small detail, it was clear that Harry was a figure of importance, even if most didn't fully understand why. And that, Lockons thought, was his opportunity. After all, wasn't fame what he had always craved? Even in his state of amnesia, this old desire to be famous was still alive and well in Locken's heart. It was the only thing that seemed to have survived the fog of his forgetfulness. In his mind, a plan began to form. The more he thought about it, the more excited he became. He would write a book about Harry Potter. This would be the perfect opportunity to re-enter the public eye, to grab the attention of the wizarding world once again. He imagined the title, The Boy Who Lived, A Hero's Journey, or something equally dramatic. Lockens could already see himself basking in the glory of another bestseller, just like his previous works. Only this time it would be different. This book would be about someone much greater than any of his past subjects, someone who had survived a curse that no one else had. It would be a book that would forever cement Locken's place in the literary history of the magical world. But the idea wasn't entirely formed yet. The thought of writing a book had always been something of a distant dream for Lockens, something he'd toyed with in his head, but never truly pursued. However, now, with the magic of the moment and the inspiration brought on by Harry's presence, it seemed like a real possibility. He knew that people would want to read about Harry. They would want to hear his story, and they would want to know what it was like to be the boy who lived. And of course, Lockens was certain that they would want to read about how he, the great Zwartepust Lockens, had met him and been a part of his remarkable life. It wasn't just the idea of writing a book that excited Lockens, it was the possibility of getting Harry's autograph. Of course, Harry had no idea who Lockens was, but that didn't stop the professor from hoping. Lockens was determined that one way or another, Harry would sign his book, and that would be the true symbol of success. He would frame it in his office, and whenever anyone came to visit, he would show them the precious memento, the autograph of the boy who had survived. It was a way of clinging to his dream of fame, even in his current fragmented state. And so the idea began to take root. Despite his memory loss, Lockens still knew how to use the power of celebrity to his advantage. He didn't need to understand the deeper complexities of Harry's life. He only needed to recognize the extraordinary power that Harry held. And this power, in Lockens' mind, was something that he could tap into. Harry was the key to his success, the missing piece that would make him relevant again. It was a thought that consumed him. He had lost everything, his memory, his pride, his dignity. But in Harry Potter, he saw an opportunity to reclaim it all. Lockens would later approach Harry, and even though Harry was confused by the encounter, Lockens remained resolute. He explained that he wanted to write a book about him, that he wanted to chronicle Harry as heroism for the world to read. Harry, ever the humble hero, had no idea what Lockens was talking about. He didn't understand why someone would want to write about him, especially given that he was just a boy who had lived through a terrifying past. But none of that mattered to Lockens. All that mattered was that Harry was a living legend, and if Lockens could associate himself with that, then he too could become a part of that legend. Of course, this meeting didn't go quite as planned. Harry's memories of the events surrounding his life and his connection to the wizarding world were still very much in progress, and he didn't understand the significance of being the boy who lived. But Lockens didn't care about Harry's lack of understanding. He was more interested in how Harry made him feel important, significant, and worthy of attention. In his eyes, that was all that mattered. Lockens left the hospital, his mind buzzing with ideas for the book. He didn't know how he would write it or where he would start, but he knew that he had to try. The book would be a way of recapturing the attention of the wizarding world, a world that had all but forgotten him. And in Harry he found not just a subject for his book, but a way back to the fame he so desperately craved. He began to make plans, sketching out the structure of the book in his mind. He would start with Harry, early years, tracing his survival against all odds. He would delve into the mystery of how Harry had become so famous and why people admired him so much. Lockens would weave in his own experiences, of course, making sure that his encounter with Harry was given the attention it deserved. He wasn't sure how to explain the details of the meeting itself. After all, it hadn't been a grand, dramatic moment. But in Lockens' mind, it didn't matter. The important thing was that he had met Harry Potter, and that alone was enough to make him famous once again. Lockens spent countless hours drafting the book in his mind, and as he did, he found himself growing more and more obsessed with the idea. His amnesia no longer seemed like such an obstacle. He could work through it, he could push past it. All he needed was to write to tell the story of the boy who lived, and to make sure that the world knew the truth about his own role in that story. After all, fame and recognition were the only things that really mattered to Zwartopus Lockens. In the end, Lockens never did write that book. Life, as it often does, got in the way. His memory continued to falter, and he never quite managed to gather the focus necessary to complete his ambitious project. But for a time, he was consumed by the dream. And in that brief moment, he believed that he had found the key to reclaiming the fame and success he had lost. Whether or not the book would have been a success didn't matter. What mattered was that for a short time, Zwartopus Lockens was once again a part of something bigger than himself, a legend, a hero at his tail. And he would never forget that feeling. Number 27. Quirinus Quirrell feared Snape more than Harry. In the world of Harry Potter, where intrigue and deception often shroud the most important truths, there exists a curious and ironic fact about one of its more tragic characters. Professor Quirrell, the timid and seemingly incompetent teacher of defense against the dark arts, was not so much afraid of Harry Potter, but rather of Severus Snape. This fact is not one that is immediately clear to those watching the films, where Quirrell's fear of Harry, especially as he is being manipulated by Voldemort, seems to be his greatest concern. The movies emphasize Quirrell's terror of Dumbledore and Harry, the latter of whom he believes might thwart his mission. However, the books provide a far more nuanced and chilling portrayal of Quirrell. Greatest fear: the ever-watchful and cunning Severus Snape. Professor Quirrell, a character who initially comes across as a nervous and ineffective wizard, has far more depth than his outwardly shaky demeanor suggests. Underneath the surface of his nervous stammer and trembling hands lies a man who is caught in a web of fear and manipulation. Quirrell's fear of Harry Potter is, in fact, overshadowed by his absolute terror of Snape, who from the very beginning is suspicious of Quirrell's true loyalties. Quirrell, despite his outward appearances, is not a fool. He is fully aware of Snape's keen ability to detect deceit and subterfuge. Snape, with his sharp intelligence and piercing gaze, immediately senses that Quirrell is hiding something, and this makes Quirrell uneasy from the start. One particular moment in the first book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, reveals just how deep Quirrell's fear of Snape runs. When Quirrell meets Snape in the Forbidden Forest, it is clear that this is not just a casual encounter. Quirrell is under the scrutiny of Snape, who, with his dark eyes and his cold demeanour, makes Quirrell feel the full weight of suspicion. Snape knows that something is amiss, and he is determined to find out what. The encounter in the forest is not just a random meeting, it is a calculated interrogation, where Snape pressures Quirrell subtly but powerfully, until Quirrell is forced to divulge something of his true intentions. Quirrell, terrified of Snape's abilities, fears that Snape will see through his facade and expose him for the traitor he has become under Voldemort's influence. This scene in the Forbidden Forest is a pivotal moment, showing just how deeply Quirrell is trapped between his master, Voldemort, and Snape, who remains ever vigilant. Snape does not act openly against Quirrell, but his actions are a clear threat to Quirrell, who understands that Snape's suspicion could unravel his entire plan. Snape's ability to notice small details, his knowledge of the dark arts, and his general cunning make him a far greater threat to Quirrell than anyone else, including Dumbledore, whom Quirrell tries to avoid. This is an interesting turn of events, as the reader's perception of Snape, who is so often seen as the villainous figure in the story, begins to shift. It becomes clear that Snape's actions, though misunderstood by Harry and the others, are actually meant to protect the school and its students, especially from Quirrell, who is far more dangerous than he appears. Throughout the year, Quirrell is constantly aware of Snape as watchful eyes. While Harry is fixated on the idea that Snape is the one trying to steal the Philosopher's Stone, Quirrell knows that Snape is merely trying to keep him in check. Snape, though often harsh and cryptic in his interactions with Harry, is not the true villain of this story. Instead, Snape is playing a far more complex role, one that involves covertly preventing Quirrell from achieving his goals without revealing his own motivations. His actions are deliberate, meant to obstruct Quirrell without raising too much suspicion. At no point does Snape openly confront Quirrell, but his subtle interference is enough to keep Quirrell on edge. Ironically, as the story unfolds, it becomes apparent that Quirrell's fears are misplaced in one important regard. Harry, who he considers to be a potential threat, is far less dangerous than Snape. Throughout much of the first book, Quirrell is focused on Harry's role in the events surrounding the Philosopher's Stone. He's terrified that Harry, as the Keats quote 55, might somehow thwart his efforts to obtain the stone. Yet, while Harry does indeed play a pivotal role in the final confrontation, Quirrell's true enemy throughout the year is Snape. It is Snape's silent vigilance that ultimately prevents Quirrell from succeeding in his mission, not Harry's actions. It is fascinating to consider the dramatic irony in this situation. While Harry believes that Snape is the villain, and Quirrell seems to fear Harry, it is in fact Snape who is quietly working to prevent Quirrell from achieving his dark goals. The true dynamic of their relationship is revealed only in the final chapters of Philosopher's Stone, where Harry learns that Snape's apparent animosity toward him is a cover for his efforts to protect him. The tension that Quirrell feels throughout the year, thinking that Snape is out to get him, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Snape's true intentions. Snape's primary concern is not to harm Quirrell, but to ensure that Quirrell does not succeed in bringing Voldemort back to power. In this light, Snape's harsh behavior towards Harry makes sense. It is all part of a larger strategy to protect the stone, Hogwarts, and even Harry himself from the forces that Quirrell serves. The revelation that Snape is working against Quirrell is a key turning point in the series, one that has lasting repercussions for the rest of the books. It shifts the perspective on Snape, who up until this point has been viewed with suspicion and fear by both Harry and the reader. Snape's role as a protector, though concealed beneath layers of bitterness and sarcasm, becomes clear in this moment. This moment also underscores the complexity of the characters in Harry Potter, where the lines between good and evil are often blurred and appearances can be deceiving. Quirrell, his fate, ultimately, is sealed not by his fear of Harry, but by his fear of Snape and the forces that Snape represents. While Quirrell may have initially believed that he could manipulate Snape or escape his notice, he is ultimately undone by Snape's quiet but effective intervention. In the end, Quirrell's terror of Snape is proven to be the most justified of all his fears. Snape's actions in the forest and throughout the school year are not simply those of a suspicious teacher. They are the actions of someone who is fully aware of the danger that Quirrell poses and who is working tirelessly to stop him. The irony of Quirrell's terror is made all the more poignant when we realize that his fear of Snape was the one thing that kept him from achieving his goal. While Voldemort may have controlled Quirrell's actions, it was Snape's suspicion and careful observations that ultimately thwarted Voldemort's plans. Quirrell's greatest mistake was not underestimating Harry, but underestimating Snape, whose silent resistance was the real force standing between him and the Philosopher's Stone.